France. He might even be joining us live right now, so wave hello to Spain. When we get to the Q&A portion, after Charlene has had a chance to present her material, I will probably shove a microphone in your face when you ask a question. So please just roll with that so that people across the ocean can hear your question too. If you have to leave early, grab snack food so I don't have to throw it away, and make sure you take those purple sheets with you. Each purple sheet has a list of books and a list of articles related to the topics that you'll hear about today, including several articles that Charlene has written. So that's a really great way to follow up on this topic if you want to continue to learn more. So let me grab my cheat sheet and introduce Charlene so we can get going. So Charlene completed 2 bachelor's degrees, one in Western Ontario and one in Memorial University, before moving on to get her master's at the University of Michigan and her PhD at McGill. She's the author of Building Strong Music Programs, a handbook for perseverance and novice, pre-service, thank you. Pre-service and novice music teachers, which is a MENC publication, which was chosen by Choice magazine as the 2010 Outstanding Academic Title. She's the former president of the Quebec Music Educators Association, has several articles published, like I mentioned. A lot of those are linked on the back of those purple sheets, if you want to follow up with that. She's also the recipient of a major Canadian federal grant, research grant for the study of development and experience of performance anxiety in children and adolescents, a lot of which we'll hear today, although it's certainly been updated. And she's the former chair of music education at McGill University. She's currently on faculty here at the music ed department, and I'm really glad you could be here today. Please welcome Charlene.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here, and I thank you all for coming. I hope that after I've talked for a little bit, you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions and share your insights on some of the issues that we'll talk about today. So just a little bit background about how I came to be an anxiety researcher. I've been interested in it for a long time. As an undergraduate, I was a performance major. I'm a pianist. And it certainly was something that I experienced in my own performing life. When I started graduate school 20 years ago, I started to look into the whole anxiety issue more deeply and look at the scientific literature on the topic. And it was interesting because at that time, there really hadn't been anything, or virtually nothing, I should say, done on musicians younger than college age. All the studies were on professional performers or college-level performers. Children and adolescents really weren't considered at all. And having been an anxious performer for as long as I could remember, and having taught many, many children, it was clear to me that part of the story was missing. So I started to delve into looking at children and adolescents and their experience with performance anxiety. Since that time, I think I published my first academic article in '98, and there were numerous ones since that time. Other researchers have come to look at anxiety in children, and I think it's fair to say that the tide has shifted in performance anxiety literature with regard to musicians, that we really are looking more at what's happening at the younger stages and understanding the etiology behind performance anxiety. The hope, at least from my perspective as a music educator, is that ultimately we may come around to some understanding about how we can better train musicians so that it becomes less of a deterrent in performers' lives. So today, what I'm planning to do, I will talk about my own research, but I would prefer to situate that in the context of what we know in general. So what other researchers have done, what we've learned about performance anxiety, and some of the contributions that I've made in that regard. Most of the time, I probably won't specifically talk about my own studies. We'll do a brief overview, what we know about adult performers, move into developing musicians, and then some of the work that has been done looking at important adults in musicians' lives. And finally, we'll end up with questions from the floor. MPA, Music Performance Anxiety 101. So across the literature on adult musicians, there have been many studies on performance anxiety, often large-scale studies on hundreds and hundreds of musicians, professional performers, and their health concerns. And what has consistently shown up is that performance anxiety tops the list of all health concerns of performing musicians at the professional level. In one study of very high-level performers, we found that 63% of professional performing musicians said their lives, not just their performing lives, but their lives would have been happier, less stressed, and more satisfying had performance anxiety not been something that was a regular occurrence for them. How do we define performance anxiety? So people often talk about stage fright. It's more than stage fright. Typically, we're dealing with an apprehension before the stage event. Paul Salmon put this definition out in 1990, and it's been pretty much the working definition for most anxiety researchers to this day. The experience of persisting distressful apprehension about and/or actual impairment of performance skills in a public context to a degree unwarranted given the individual's musical aptitude, training, and level of preparation. So you can see that's a pretty loaded definition there, right? We're talking about the apprehension, which I already mentioned, which can occur well in advance of an actual performance, months in advance, weeks in advance, days in advance. To a degree unwarranted, given the individual's ability, training, and level of preparation. And those are really key because a lot of times musicians are admonished to simply practice more, or you weren't well enough prepared, and that's why you were anxious at the performance. And this definition throws that out the window, that you can be as talented, you can be as prepared as you want. If you are someone who tends to get anxious in performance situations, then you are likely to still get anxious in that performance context. The American Psychological Association talks about performance anxiety. They recognize it as a form of social anxiety, where individuals are afraid of appearing foolish or being negatively judged in a public context. Right? People can have performance anxiety that's specific to the performance context without actually having social anxiety or social phobias in other contexts. So you might be very comfortable in a party situation or even comfortable as a public speaker, but as a musician, suffer from performance anxiety. If you think about the definition then of performance anxiety and this fear of appearing foolish or being judged negatively, and performance situations that we often find ourselves in as musicians, for anxious people who are high in what we call trait anxiety, a tendency to become anxious, there is certainly a high evaluative threat there. We look at performance anxiety as a three-dimensional issue with behavioral components, physiological components, and cognitive and psychological components. Here we're largely talking about manifestations of anxiety. So we'll look at some of those, and I'm sure that many of them will appear familiar to you. Behavioral manifestations. So when people suffer from performance anxiety, they may exhibit any type of behavioral manifestations, such as repetitive behaviors. So people who are constantly moistening their lips, blinking their eyes. Some people fidget with their hair. Any type of behavior like this. Facial expressions, grimacing, fidgeting, restlessness, pacing are very common. Speech disfluency, so we're not being clear in our speech. Postural collapse, so we're hunching over in a protective type of stance. Clenching the muscles, so sometimes you're even unaware of it. Your arms may be clenched, your toes may be clenched. Sometimes we see it in the jaw, tight jaw. And avoidance behavior. So avoidance is simply I'm not going to do that performance because I'm anxious. And I'd like you to remember this one. We're going to come back to it a little later in the presentation. Physiological manifestations. I'm sure that many of these look familiar. So cold extremities or sweaty, clammy hands. I'm a pianist, so that often comes to mind. Racing heartbeat, shallow breathing, dry mouth, which is particularly problematic for wind players and singers. Stomach upset, inability to sleep well, lack of fine motor control, shaking, impaired coordination, increased perspiration, and increased need to use the rest facilities. Psychological manifestations, then, these are often the most troubling for individuals. They're a little more challenging in many circumstances to overcome. Fear, panic, worry, catastrophic thoughts. So there we're talking about, the world is going to end if this doesn't go well, or my world as I know it. My career will be totally derailed if this performance doesn't go well. An inability to focus is particularly problematic. Altered perception of time. Time is going taking forever. Memory slips. Those are often very problematic for performers who don't use a score, as many Berklee students perform that way. Interfering thoughts, so negative thoughts that are just plaguing musicians, that are hard to get away from. Cloudy thinking, fear of losing control during the performance, that fear of negative evaluation, right? What is the audience going to say? What is my teacher going to say? What is my family going to say? Distractibility, a loss of objectivity and perspective, feeling of unreality, that this is happening to somebody else, right? I'm not really here. And of course, there are other manifestations as well, but these are commonly seen in the literature. So then if you think about those manifestations of anxiety and consider musical performance and try to put the two together, we know that high-level musical performance requires a high level of fine motor control. It requires physical presence. I mean, you have to be there. We can't avoid it. And a clear, focused thought process. And consider the three lists that you just saw regarding manifestations. Anxiety can clearly diminish each of these areas that you need for a successful performance, making it very difficult for performers to perform at their best. And unfortunately, we know that career decisions, college acceptance decisions, even acceptance to certain ensembles within college once you've arrived, they depend upon successful performance skills. And it doesn't really matter how good you are in a practice room. Right? You can be the most outstanding musician ever. Decisions are often based not on that, but on how well you can demonstrate them in a performance context. Some things we know about what affects an individual's performance anxiety. These are based on research studies that have looked specifically at certain components. There are others, and as we go through the presentation, you may think of, well, she didn't mention this or she didn't mention that. It's probably because no one has looked at that yet in a systematic way, in a scientific way. These are the external factors that we have seen fairly consistently as issues for performers. The size of the audience, right? Is this a teeny tiny audience or an enormous audience? The stature of the audience, and sometimes the stature and the size become intertwined, right? You can have a really small audience of really important folks that makes you much more anxious than an enormous audience of people who are less important to you, right, in terms of your career and so on. The presence of judges clearly, and I'm sure that you've all taken juries and had performance exams and can attest to this one. And the absence of the musical score, we have seen in at least one study at this point that, sure, if we ask musicians to get up there and perform with their score in front of them, their anxiety is significantly less than if we yank that score away from them. But this is an important component because some musicians, classical or contemporary, are simply required to perform without the score. So this is an issue. And then there are factors internal to the musician that we know have an impact. Perfectionism. This one I think is particularly key because my personal feeling is that we breed perfectionism into our young musicians, right? That it has to be right. It has to be right, and you can't make mistakes. And you will see that as we talk about studies pertaining to children and adolescents, that this is very clear in their minds from a very young age that they are afraid to make any mistakes. Low self-esteem, we've seen this consistently, that self-esteem is negatively related to anxiety. Feelings of low personal control, that you're not really, that this is out of your hands. A predisposition towards irrational beliefs, so individuals who look at this one performance as the make it or break it of their career, whether or not that's true, often it's not true. I think we know that occasionally it is true, but often it's not the make it or break it, but some people really have that predisposition to believe that it's all over if this one doesn't go well. A general poor ability for coping with stress, and distractibility. So if you have a tendency to be distracted, this can compound your anxiety. So how do adults cope with performance anxiety? It's very interesting. All of the things I've listed here have been repeatedly mentioned by musicians in articles, in research studies, in books. Most of them have not actually been studied. A few of them have, with often very tenuous findings about their ability to actually reduce anxiety. Medication and therapy, we know, can be effective. Therapy takes a while. Medication doesn't necessarily take a while. We know lots of musicians who take beta blockers. There's been a lot of research on beta blockers. And if your symptoms of anxiety are physiological and not the psychological stuff, then they can help you, right? Low-level beta blockers can help you. Of course, it's serious medication. This is heart medication, and if you have certain health conditions, it's problematic if you take it. Some musicians take beta blockers kind of under the counter, under the table, without doctors checking them out first, and that's a particularly troublesome matter because it could cause big problems for you. Beta blockers don't help if it's the worry and the fear and so on that's plaguing you. Lots of musicians have a drink before a performance, meditate, do all sorts of physical care type of strategies. Very few of these have actually been considered in the research literature, but I'm sure that you know as well as I do people who swear by them, right? That they have a certain meal before a performance, or they meditate, they pray, and so on. I'm going to move on now to the literature on developing musicians. And we're going to start with the babies, the 3- and 4-year-olds. There's only been one study, and this is very recent. A doctoral student of mine from McGill University did her dissertation looking at experiences of the very beginning performers. And this came about from looking at various studies that talked about or questioned whether or not performance anxiety is innate or developed, right? Is this something that you're just born with, that you're going to be an anxious performer, or is it something that develops over time and that maybe is part of the training process? So we thought if we looked at the youngest musicians, maybe we could get a handle on this. So to situate this actual study, it took place in 2 preschools, 3 and 4-year-old children, some of whom had had performance experiences before, usually in group contexts, right? When you're 3 years old, you give a holiday performance with all your friends for your parents, or a dance show, or a ballet, figure skating show, something like that. But many of the children had not ever performed before, and they were enrolled in music classes for a semester. So everybody had these group music lessons. They played with some classroom instruments, worked on their rhythmic skills, they sang some songs together, and then at the end of the semester, they gave 2 shows for their parents. What was very interesting was that the children who had never performed before, when they responded to questions about the upcoming performance, so we have a standardized inventory that looked at how the children were feeling about the impending performance. Children who had never performed before, they were anxious about what was coming up. Right? And the children who had performed before were much less anxious. They said, no, it'll be okay. Right? However, at the actual concerts, when we took cortisol samples, cortisol is a stress hormone, and we had baseline cortisol samples from just a regular school day from a few weeks before as well. What we found was that the children who had performed before had very high stress hormone levels, higher than the children for whom this was the first time. So even though the children who had performed before a couple of weeks in advance of the performance felt, okay, I know what I'm getting into, this is going to be okay, at the actual performance, were quite stressed about it. What we also found was that familiarity with the performance venue seemed to have an impact. So I mentioned there were 2 daycares or 2 preschools. One of the preschools performed in a venue that was quite familiar to them. They'd been there many times before for various events. The other children performed in a venue that they had never been in before. The second group exhibited much higher anxiety than the first group. So this is actually good news when you think about our ability to often get in the performance space before the actual performance and have some run-throughs and get comfortable with the space, and that perhaps ameliorating the anxiety experience. What we see with young children very commonly is crying. So adults, we don't often do that. We might want to, but we don't. Little children do. They'll cry, they'll turn away, they'll refuse to participate in performance experiences. And what's interesting about this is that many children's programs, certainly elementary schools, require children to perform. It's part of the training process. And I think most parents think of it as, and teachers think of it as, oh, such a nice opportunity for the children to get up there and show what they can do. I'm a mom of 3 children, with 1 more coming. And I've seen my children go through these experiences. I wonder sometimes who those performances are actually serving. Often it's not the children, right? It's for the parents or for the teachers. So something to consider. Moving on to elementary school, we've seen that performance anxiety appears to be firmly ingrained by at least 3rd grade. Okay? It may be younger. We know that test anxiety, which is closely linked with performance anxiety, appears to be firmly ingrained by 2nd grade, with signs that it may occur earlier. Nobody's looked at kindergarten through 2nd grade yet. Those grades are just out there in the ether. But we do know, certainly by 3rd grade, children expect to be anxious when they get up on stage, even if they're not all by themselves. They might be with 60 of their grade mates. It's still an anxiety-inducing experience. The onset of puberty appears to increase anxiety. And as we mentioned with adults, it seems quite clear that performance anxiety is negatively related to self-esteem. So if you have low self-esteem, probably your performance anxiety is minimal. If you, sorry, other way around. If you have low self-esteem, you probably have high performance anxiety and vice versa. Okay. We've seen gender differences in children. They do not emerge in 3rd grade, 4th grade, but by 5th grade and through adulthood, there seems to be a difference in the way boys and girls respond to performance anxiety. These results that I've put here refer to a study I did many years ago on 12-year-old children who were performing in a piano recital. And the kids, they'd been playing for 3 years. You know, they were, I would say, intermediate level performers at this point. They'd performed at least half a dozen times or so before, so it wasn't a brand new experience for any of them. What I did was monitored their heart rate with, you know, those wireless heart rate monitors go under their shirt, no one can see them, their anxious behaviors, and their performance quality. From the moment they were the next person to go on stage, so somebody else just went up and they're performing and I'm waiting, through the end of their actual performance. And what I saw was that girls' anxiety measures were very predictable, right? The little girls who had a lot of anxious behaviors, had very high heart rates, and they did not perform so well. Right? With boys, it was a mixed bag. The boys who had a lot of anxious behaviors, so they were fidgeting, they were turning around, they were restless, they looked completely distracted before they went on stage, actually kept pretty normal heart rates until they got on stage, and then their heart rates spiked, but they played well. Okay? The boys who were sitting, next person to play, not moving, right? No anxious behaviors, had really high heart rates at that moment. And when they got on stage, it just did not go so well. So it seems that perhaps this type of acting out or anxious behaviors for boys may be a coping mechanism, an unconscious coping mechanism, that they're just simply, I'm not going to think about that right now. I'm going to do all these other things, and I'll deal with it when I get on stage. So that's my working hypothesis. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. I see lots of gentlemen in the room. It's interesting, those same children, when I interviewed them, I asked them to talk about, you know, if they're nervous, what do they do? And these are 3 quotes directly from the kids. And you remember, they're only 12. You know, these children, they were in 6th grade at the time. I said, I take a deep breath and tell myself I can do it. I pretend there's no one there, just my parents, and tell myself to play my best. Then I relax a bit. Another child said, I think about playing the piano only, not about the people around me. And finally, I just block my mind and play. Right? So these are fairly advanced coping strategies that a lot of adults use. And it's interesting that even at 12 years old, they have developed these strategies for themselves. We moved from elementary school into middle school and high school. It seems in the more recent literature with today's generation of high school students that students are becoming more vocal about this issue. When I was a college student, even as a graduate student, performance anxiety really was not something you talked about, right? If you suffered from performance anxiety, you suffered in silence and you did your own thing. I think it was seen as a handicap at that point. And today, it seems that young people are becoming more vocal. They're realizing earlier on that, wait a minute, I'm not the only one experiencing this. Lots of my friends are anxious performers too, and could somebody please do something to help us with this? They're asking their teachers and their schools for support. This fear of making mistakes is particularly troubling. The presence of their teacher at performances is particularly troubling. Right? As a music educator, this makes me uncomfortable. We don't want our teachers there. We might want them there, but when they're there, that really makes us nervous. And of course, it's that knowledge that the teacher knows when something isn't just right or isn't the same as when you were at your last lesson. Peers increase anxiety, in particular, musician peers, right? I think that as musicians, we understand this. I think that the general public would probably be surprised by that finding. They would think that, well, wouldn't it be a good thing to have your friends in the audience? Sometimes we really don't want our friends in the audience, especially our musician friends, because we know that they know. And we also know that at some level, no matter how good a friend they are, that they're judging us, right? And so they can increase our anxiety. The expectation to perform well increases anxiety. This was shown in a study on middle school band students who are auditioning for Allstate. And students who came from schools with a solid reputation, high-achieving reputation, were much more anxious about how they were going to do on these auditions than students who came from schools where, the expectations weren't really so high. Gender appears to be a major factor. As I said, that begins in 5th grade. It does not change through adulthood. It's quite consistent. Well, it changes a little bit through puberty, just onset of puberty. But for the most part, by and large, through adulthood, women report more anxiety and have more anxious responses than men. Now, the reporting thing, of course, we have to take with a grain of salt when we ask someone how anxious they are, or we ask people to fill out an inventory regarding their anxiety. We can't always be certain that that actually reflects their level of anxiety. It may be that women are more in tune with their anxiety. It may be that women are more comfortable in telling the truth about how anxious they are, or maybe not underestimating their anxiety, or that men may be a little bit more inhibited to fully disclose. So we're not 100% sure on that fact, but certainly the heart rates don't lie, and women do have higher heart rates when they're anxious than men. And self-esteem and practice, we've talked about self-esteem is very consistent. We've seen in at least one study that practice is negatively related to anxiety, and that's probably no surprise, right? That if you haven't practiced enough, well, probably you're going to be anxious, right? If we think back to the original definition of anxiety, practice is not meant to be a component that you can still be anxious even if you've practiced and practiced and practiced, but if you haven't practiced enough, you might be asking for trouble when you're a teenager. A recent study by Diana Kenny, who has a wonderful book, it's on your resource list, recent book, just last year or the year before, on performance anxiety. The study looked at troubling performances. She asked students to think about their worst performance ever and kind of chronicle that and considered that with regard to their current experiences in performance anxiety. And what she found was that even as musicians age, if they had a particularly traumatic performance experience when they were teenagers, that seems to impact upon their subsequent performance experiences, that it sticks with them, that fear that that could happen again. Among gifted adolescent musicians, so students who've been handpicked to study at special music schools, we've seen that at least a third of them suffer from high levels of performance anxiety. Okay? Most musicians have some level of performance anxiety. Something like 20–25% who say that it's really not an issue for them. But for the other 75 or so percent, it is an issue. With gifted adolescent musicians, a third of them truly suffer from performance anxiety to a high degree. A study I did a few years ago looked at high school band musicians and whether or not their anxiety impacted upon their future education and career path decisions. And certainly it does seem to be the case that high school musicians who really suffer from performance anxiety are less likely to pursue their career in music, that they will choose a different path regardless of how good they are. And college level musicians. Pre-performance nervousness and stage fright have been seen to be among the top 10 concerns of college music majors. Success in performance is highly linked with self-esteem. Okay? There was a study done a number of years ago that looked at performance anxiety and age of beginning studies. And I can't remember the initial number, a large number of students who begin their music studies before they're 7 years old. But by the time children are 12, most musicians will have started their training by the time they're 12 years old. So it really makes a lot of sense then when you consider that by the time they get to college, their self-esteem and their musical success, their performance success, are highly intertwined. It's part of their being, part of their psyche. Anticipatory worry, fear of making mistakes, that keeps coming back, worry about audience reactions, and somatic or the physical anxiety responses are among the top-rated stressful aspects of performing for college music majors. Last year, I did a study here at Berkeley. Most of the research on performance anxiety, almost all of it, has focused on Western classical musicians. Most music schools are Western classical music schools. So I thought I'd take a look and see what's happening with our young contemporary musicians. And I don't know if anybody here was part of that study. There were several hundred participants. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head. 200-300 students that I surveyed. And so the students completed a questionnaire all about their performance background, about their major and so on. And then they completed an inventory, an anxiety inventory that looked at performance anxiety, general anxiety, family history of anxiety, which is tied in with performance anxiety, and also depression, which is also closely linked. And what I found was across Berkeley students, or the Berkeley participants, worry about performance outcome was across the board. Worry about how the audience is going to respond, and rumination about the performance success after it was finished, right? So I've performed, and I just can't get it out of my head. I'm still thinking about it the next day and the next week. How did the audience respond, and how did I do? With regard to coping mechanisms, I was very interested to look at this. Most students are really looking at a holistic approach to coping with anxiety. So things like breathing exercises, exercise, meditation, as their approach to dealing with anxiety. Around the 50% mark, 30 to 50% mark for that. However, I was somewhat surprised to find that relatively few of our students, so 15%, between 10 and 15% of our students talked about using either medications or drugs, alcohol, or counseling services to cope with their performance anxiety. So the alcohol and drugs thing, yes, I was happy to see that. Counseling service, a little less so. I mean, we do have on-site counseling, so it was surprising that students are not really availing of that service. We talked about avoidance way back at the beginning of the presentation. very surprising, 21% of the participants reported using avoidance to cope with their performance anxiety. So if I just don't do it, I won't get anxious. Surprising from the perspective that this is a music college and students have to perform to get in here, and you know it's part of a musician's life to some degree, certainly at the college level. So I thought that number was a little bit high, surprising. Okay, I'm going to move on to talk about adult roles, okay? Teachers, conductors, and parents. A number of studies have put it out there that maybe teachers have some role to play here, right? Not trying to put any blame on anybody, but could teachers be part of the issue? Is this part of the training process for musicians? We have seen, especially in the sports anxiety literature, which is much more extensive than the music performance anxiety literature, that coaches and athletic directors can have a direct impact upon their young athletes' level of anxiety, for better and for worse. So there have been just a couple of studies that have looked at this issue with regard to teachers. We saw already that high-achieving adolescent musicians have been talking about wanting less pressure in their lessons, okay? And that they would like to be able to talk openly and honestly with their teachers. And we're seeing more and more of that being reported. The lesson factor is interesting. I did a study a number of years ago specifically on relationship with teachers, and found that almost half of the students reported that at least some of the time they feel nervous in their lessons. And this has come back in a couple of other studies where it seems that many musicians consider their lesson, their private lesson, to be kind of a mini performance, right? It's not on the same scale as actually getting out on the stage, but you haven't seen your teacher for a week, you've been working on all this stuff, and now I've got to go and show what I've done. So there does seem to be a level of anxiety involved there. Most students do say that their teacher encourages them to perform, right? They want them to get out there when there are performance opportunities. They want them to practice performing. But less than half of the students that we've looked at say that their teachers actually provide practice performance opportunities for them. So there are no studio classes or master classes to try out your performances in front of your peers. It's, I'd like you to do it, so do it, right, without the training part. So the practice performance and memorization strategies, again, talking about those musicians who have to perform from memory, they're not really talked about. How do we actually memorize for performance settings? Very interesting. The Berkeley study that I did last year, I had a number of participants stay behind after testing sessions to talk about their issues with performance anxiety. One student came to me and said, you know, I had such trouble with anxiety in this, I'm not going to name departments here, but in one particular department where she had started, and I just could get no help from the teachers. They didn't understand it. They thought, you know, if I'm anxious, that maybe this just wasn't the right place for me. And she said, I almost dropped out. But I finally decided, you know, there was another instrument, another department that I also could work with in terms of my skills and her playing ability and whatnot. So I switched departments, and it's been a totally different experience there. So I asked her, so you know, was it the instrument or the department or the teachers? And she said, you know, it was really a bit of both. Something to do with the culture of the first instrument versus the second instrument, but also the understanding nature of the teachers and the department that made a lot of difference. Another student kind of leaned over to me after he'd turned it in his paper and said, you know, this is really interesting because a lot of us have talked about the fact that this institution, for a performance school or for a music school, it does a really good job of training us to play, but not such a great job of teaching us how to perform. And they're really not the same thing. And so these are obviously out of the words of participants, and I'm sure that really varies from teacher to teacher and department to department, but just that notion, that awareness that playing and performing are not necessarily the same thing. Oh, do I have the same thing here twice? Very similar. We've talked about this. Yeah. Oh, no, we haven't. So teenagers talking about that's when they're most anxious, is when their teachers are actually present at their lessons, at their performances, sorry. Teacher advice for coping. So this was a study of, I want to say high school students. I can't remember which paper I took it from, one of my studies. I think it was high school students. Asking them, so does your teacher give you any advice for coping with performance anxiety? And if he or she does, what do they say? What is the advice? And so I've given you the percentages here. You can see that most teachers don't really know what to say, right? They don't really know how to deal with the performance anxiety issue. 13% was the highest response that we got. So deep breathing. This one I love. Relax, relax. I don't know how that helps any of us. I know when people tell me to relax, it just causes me stress. Asking students to concentrate or pretend no one's there, just ignore the audience. You'll be happy you did it. Most of these, they're kind of platitudes, right? They're nice things to hear, but whether or not they're actually helpful is questionable. So I think part of the problem with teachers dealing with anxiety is not so much that they don't want to, but maybe they don't know how to. It wasn't part of their training, and they're not quite sure how to help their students with it. Conductors. So this was a study on semi-pro singers, okay? Very high-level singers, but who weren't professionals. That wasn't the focus of their lives. Asked them, does the conductor influence your anxiety? Yes. Almost everybody said, yes, it does. How much difference does the conductor make? Almost 60% said that they really make a lot of difference, right? And only 12% said, yeah, not really so much. What do conductors do that make their singers anxious? Well, when the conductors are anxious, the singers are anxious, right? If they're in a bad mood, this makes their musicians anxious. If they have bad rehearsal skills, bad conducting skills, this is a problem. Being disrespectful, calling out individuals in rehearsals, this causes people a lot of anxiety. Bad organization, negative body language, a conductor who is not confident, right? We really do have to put on our actors' hats when we get in front of an ensemble. Perfectionist, being rushed, making last-minute changes, and arrogance people talked about. Right? We want a conductor who's a nice, normal person, who's well-prepared, who knows what they're doing, who's not going to change things at the last second, and who's not going to stress us out. How much difference does a conductor make? These are quotes. The first one is, it kind of cracks me up a little bit, but it's not actually funny. Very important. It can rob me of joy. 75% conductor, 25% self. The conductor, quote, can make or break a performance, can cause normally confident singers to feel uncomfortable and more prone to errors. Completely, they control the environment. And the conductor's disappointment is shouldered by all. Parents. Only 2 studies have looked at parents. One of them is mine. One is by Julia Papit-Georgi in England. And all that we have seen so far is that students who perceive that their parents are very critical and have high expectations tend to have higher levels of anxiety. And whether or not your parents, one of your parents, also studied music can impact upon your anxiety level. Students who have a parent who studied music tend to be more anxious. Right? It's not clear at this point, we need more research. It's not clear at this point why that would be. It may have something to do with expectations or knowledge that your parents know, right? Like the teacher in the audience. If your mom or dad is out there and they didn't study music and they think that you're wonderful and that it sounds great and they're just supporting you on stage, is a different scenario than the parents who are sitting in the audience who they know what you're doing and how well you've practiced or not practiced and how well you're doing up there. So this may be how parents are implicated there. All right, so looking at all this literature and looking from an educator perspective, what can teachers do? Well, I suggest that teachers teach performance skills. Teach students how to perform and not just how to play. Give them opportunities to perform. Discuss anxiety with them, okay? Don't use the platitudes. Don't try to ignore talking about it. Talk about it. Talk about your own personal experiences and try to provide tangible suggestions for your students. If it seems to be a real issue for your students, look into local specialists. Who can you refer them to help with this issue? Discuss how to manage mistakes, how to manage memory slips. Talk about this. So it's one thing to tell your students to, don't worry about it if you make a mistake, or if you make a mistake, just keep going. Well, when we're playing high-level, complicated repertoire, that may be easier said than done. So how to do this. And talk about career options. Just because someone is a very skilled musician, it doesn't mean that performance is necessarily the right career path for them. So what are the options? I think that many high school students are not aware of the options within the music industry, and they don't really find that out until they're at the college level already, and sometimes until they graduate. What else can teachers do? Well, they can look at those perfectionist expectations and, where possible, reduce them. I know that's tricky because this is such a competitive world, right? And you do have to play really well to get ahead. Can you focus on just making an incredibly musical performance and less on were all the notes, every single note and rhythm exactly perfect, or was it a really moving performance? I know which one I would prefer. So you can think about that. Help your students to understand that performance anxiety is really, really common. There are far more musicians out there who experience performance anxiety than musicians who don't. Okay, so you're not alone. Even among very successful performers, very high-profile performers, we know that performance anxiety is a common experience. And think about the performance requirements. So I think about that with regard to younger musicians. Sometimes at the college level, we really can't avoid that. But with younger musicians, maybe we can, right? If you're 8 years old and you're a talented violinist or a talented trumpet player, do you have to perform? Is that part of the training process if it's something that is not comfortable for you? Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but I think it is something that teachers need to consider on a student-to-student basis. Final slide. Rethink those memorization requirements, right? And of course, I come at this from a classically trained pianist perspective, that everything has to be by memory. Enormous works, enormous complicated works, everything is without the score. Is that really necessary? There are other instrumentalists who regularly use the score, and there's no stigma attached. So do think about that. Studio classes, practice performances, if possible, in the actual location of the performance can be very valuable. Encourage students to record themselves, and I'm sure that many of you probably do this already, as a source of audience, right? There may be no other people in the room, but there is a recorder, and sometimes we're our own worst critics, so that can be a helpful way of practice performing. And finally, for teachers, it would be wonderful to provide that support, be supportive, and avoid showing disappointment when performances don't go quite as well as the practice, as the run-through, as the last lesson did. Students take a lot of stock. They put a lot of stock into their teacher's opinion, and they can read a lot from a teacher's response, even if it's not a verbal response. So if we can put on our actor's hat when our students don't play quite as well as we hoped they would, that can be very valuable for the student's psyche for subsequent performances. I would end with a Far Side. Poor guy. One of those anxious conductors that's stressing out all his musicians. And your turn. I'd love to hear thoughts from the audience, questions. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I kind of look at performance anxiety as
Just hold it to your face like you would a normal microphone.
I kind of look at performance anxiety as a process of alienation, that the self that we come to know through practice and through playing as a community activity, suddenly, when it's put into the model of performance,
Mm-hmm.
you are alienated from that self. You become something else. Your identity as a human being is now redefined as part of a performer-audience relationship.
Right. So initially you were the musician, and now you are
You're
the
something
performer.
else you don't recognize.
Right.
And that's the way I see
Mm-hmm.
that. So making a presupposition that there is this kind of alienation, it seems that many of the coping mechanisms that you mentioned are designed to get rid of the symptoms.
Yes.
And not to integrate one into the audience,
Right.
as is the model with folk music,
Right.
or with the dance band or something.
Right.
So I'm wondering, you mentioned cortisol, measuring cortisol. Have there been any studies that have measured oxytocin and the community hormone that
Right.
bridges people, that creates feeling of integration
Right.
with people around you? Have there been anybody, or has anybody taken a look at the underlying
The social context.
assumption of alienation and how to bridge that?
No one has considered this, not in any of the literature that I've seen, and I think it's an excellent point. In fact, the whole performer audience versus performer as part of the audience or as part of a bigger social context has not really been looked at. I think that there's, we've come a fair way with regard to performance anxiety literature, but there's really still a lot more to learn with regard to musicians.
Because this
Yeah.
speaks to the very underlying
Mm-hmm.
cause.
That's right.
Not the symptom.
That's right.
And there are cultures where the music does not have that model.
Right.
Folk community, as I mentioned,
Yeah.
jazz at its inception
Mm-hmm.
was very much a part of community.
Right.
And people achieved their virtuosity through a sense of ownership,
Right.
through a sense of individualism that was shared with a mutual language,
Right.
that of the dance hall. Even in Indian music, you have this overlying assumption that you're speaking to the divine, that it's your medium to the divine.
Right, and it's beyond yourself.
Yeah, and it's not a matter of yourself being alienated from the judging eyes of something that you can't relate to.
Yeah.
And I do see that as really a fundamental cause of,
Right.
anxiety.
Well, you know, I would say the closest thing in the research literature that comes to this, and it's not the same, it's still a performer versus audience model, but is with regard to group performances. So musicians who perform in ensembles and their experience as an ensemble performer compared with their experience as a soloist. And certainly the solo experience, as you can imagine, is much more anxiety-inducing for most musicians, but it's still there. Again, primarily looking at Western classical musicians, so the choir, band, orchestra model, even performing with large ensembles, there's still the experience of performance anxiety for many musicians. It's just less than if they were all by themselves. But these are wonderful examples. I mean, I think that looking at the more social music-making context would be very valuable to, as you suggest, getting to the underlying root of the separation.
Or even
Yeah.
In an educational situation where a classroom might be set up where a performance with the parents might be in a shape of a circle or something like that. So
Right.
it just
Bringing the audience into,
to the process.
yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Hi, I wonder if anybody's looked at people with the opposite situation, kind of natural hams, who just kind of blossom when they get in front of an audience. I wonder if there's anybody's managed to kind of figure out what they've got.
Why
and
that
maybe
is.
Managed to bottle it and sell it to the rest of us or something.
Wouldn't that be
like
great?
Yeah.
Not really. So the research that I focused on has had to do with anxious performers. Certainly there is talk about facilitating anxiety or arousal, which is not exactly the same as anxiety. It's that heightened excitement when you get in front of a group. And for some musicians, that's really a powerful thing, that they get out there and they do a far better job than they ever would have done in the practice room all by themselves. That's about as far as it gets in terms of the anxiety literature. Looking into why that is, I would say the only component that has come up in this context, in this literature, has to do with that self-esteem. People who have high self-esteem, who are highly confident individuals, seem to be able to pull off that aroused performance instead of the anxious performance. But that's an excellent suggestion for future research, just looking at the hands. Right. Thank you.
Well, I would like to just make a comment. I've been performing since I was 12 years old, and at the beginning I felt very anxious to perform in front of people. There was one time that I performed in front of 1,000 people, a piano. I played the Bohemian Rhapsody, and I was very anxious the day before. I had to practice a lot, but at the exact day, I say to myself, just have fun. Yeah, just feel the music, just play it, be with yourself in that moment, and it was one of my best performances.
That's
I don't know if
fantastic.
thinking about that helped me, if
Right.
I felt more confident or something.
Right.
Why would you think that helped me?
It sounds like there's a confidence component and a focus component. If you can just block out anything that might interfere with you having a successful performance. You know, you've put the time in, you've practiced, you're ready for it, and then if you can zone in and tune out anything negative, that you can have a really positive result. You know, does that sound familiar? That's what it sounds like to me. Yeah.
And after in fact, after the performance, I felt very well.
Yeah.
The last performance before that one, I felt very anxious, even after the performance. And this one, I felt just relaxed, I guess.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
Did it change the way you saw the audience? I mean, were you aware of the audience in a different way on that day?
Did it change how he was aware of the audience? Like, was the question.
Well, yeah, it was the first time that I played for a very big audience. But yeah, I guess it changed. And even after that performance, I've been thinking about that technique in my last performance. And now it doesn't matter how big the audience is. It's just, I just think about that and it helps me. Yeah.
That's fantastic.
I have a question to throw out there. Is there anything in the literature about like successful retraining? Because there's something in anxiety that once you've been in that state, then probably every time you get on stage, it's kind of triggered. So is there anything in the literature about elements of successful reprogramming of that, of
Right, so this comes into, it deals with the cognitive restructuring, with the therapeutical side of coping mechanisms. So people who actively seek out psychological counseling for performance anxiety. And there are institutions all across the country that focus on the needs of performers and musicians. So the whole cognitive restructuring or biofeedback, different types of approaches to, as you suggest, retraining the thought process and the physical response to anxiety that have been successful. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, you know, obviously not an immediate fix, but if you're persistent, these approaches can be very successful. Yeah. Other questions?
you have time for one or two more questions if anybody has one they want to throw out there?
Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to share with me today and to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Charlene.
You're welcome. Bye. Have a good day. In my own performing life. When I started graduate school 20 years ago, I started to look into the whole anxiety issue more deeply and look at the scientific literature on the topic. And it was interesting because at that time, there really hadn't been anything, or virtually nothing, I should say, done on musicians younger than college age. All the studies were on professional performers or college-level performers. Children and adolescents really weren't considered at all. And having been an anxious performer for as long as I could remember, and having taught many, many children, it was clear to me that part of the story was missing. So I started to delve into looking at children and adolescents and their experience with performance anxiety. Since that time, I think I published my first academic article in '98, and you know, there were numerous ones since that time. Other researchers have come to look at anxiety in children, and I think it's fair to say that the tide has shifted in performance anxiety literature with regard to musicians, that we really are looking more at what's happening at the younger stages and understanding the etiology behind performance anxiety. The hope, at least from my perspective as a music educator, is that ultimately we may come around to some understanding about how we can better train musicians so that less stressed and more satisfying, had performance anxiety not been something that was a regular occurrence for them. How do we define performance anxiety? So people often talk about stage fright. It's more than stage fright. Typically, we're dealing with an apprehension before the stage event. Paul Salmon put this definition out in 1990, and it's been pretty much the working definition for most anxiety researchers to this day. The experience of persisting distressful apprehension about and or actual impairment of performance skills in a public context to a degree unwarranted given the individual's musical aptitude, training, and level of preparation. So you can see that's a pretty loaded definition there, right? We're talking about the apprehension, which I already mentioned, which can occur well in advance of an actual performance, months in advance, weeks in advance, days in advance. To a degree unwarranted, given the individual's ability, training, and level of preparation. And those are really key because a lot of times musicians are admonished to simply practice more, or you weren't well enough prepared, and that's why you were anxious at the performance. And this definition throws that out the window, that you can be as talented, you can be as prepared as you want, if you are someone who tends to get anxious and
Charlene completed 2 bachelor's degrees, one in Western Ontario and one in Memorial University, before moving on to get her master's at the University of Michigan and her PhD at McGill. She's the author of Building Strong Music Programs, a handbook for perseverance and novice, pre-service, thank you. What is that word? Pre-service and novice music teachers, which is a Mank publication, which was chosen by Choice magazine as the 2010 Outstanding Academic Title. She's the former president of the Quebec Music Educators Association, has several articles published. Like I mentioned, a lot of those are linked on the back of those purple sheets if you want to follow up with that. She's also the recipient of a major Canadian federal grant, research grant for the study of development and experience of performance anxiety in children and adolescents, a lot of which we'll hear today, although it's certainly been updated. And she's the former chair of music education at McGill University. She's currently on faculty here at the music ed department, and I'm really glad you could be here today. Please welcome Charlene.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here, and I thank you all for coming. I hope that after I've talked for a little bit, you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions and share your insights on some of the issues that we'll talk about today. So just a little bit background about how I came to be an anxiety researcher. You know, I've been interested in it for a long time. As an undergraduate, I was a performance major. I'm a pianist. And it certainly was something that I experienced. It becomes less of a deterrent in performers' lives. So today, what I'm planning to do, I will talk about my own research, but I would prefer to situate that in the context of what we know in general. So what other researchers have done, what we've learned about performance anxiety, and some of the contributions that I've made in that regard. Most of the time, I probably won't specifically talk about my own studies. We'll do a brief overview, what we know about adult performers, move into developing musicians, and then some of the work that has been done looking at important adults in musicians' lives. And finally, we'll end up with questions from the floor. MPA, Music Performance Anxiety 101. So across the literature on adult musicians, there have been many studies on performance anxiety, often large-scale studies on hundreds and hundreds of musicians, professional performers, and their health concerns. And what has consistently shown up is that performance anxiety tops the list of all health concerns of performing musicians at the professional level. In one study of very high-level performers, we found that 63% of professional performing musicians said their lives, not just their performing lives, but their lives, would have been happier,
wave hello to Spain. When we get to the Q&A portion, after Charlene has had a chance to present her material, I will probably shove a microphone in your face when you ask a question. So please just roll with that so that people across the ocean can hear your question too. If you have to leave early, grab snack food so I don't have to throw it away, and make sure you take those purple sheets with you. Each purple sheet has a list of books and a list of articles related to the topics that you'll hear about today, including several articles that Charlene has written. So that's a really great way to follow up on this topic if you want to continue to learn more. So let me grab my cheat sheet and introduce Charlene so we can get going. So